was the perfect night for trick-or-treating. The air was crisp, the leaves crackled underfoot, and the full moon cast an eerie glow over our small town. My friends and I had been planning our route for weeks. We were all 17, but Halloween had always been our tradition. This year was going to be the last time, and we wanted to make it memorable. It was me, Tom, Jamie, and Sarah. We'd been friends since grade school, always sticking together for every haunted house, every cheesy Halloween event. But this time, we were determined to hit up every house in town, even the ones that people usually avoided. We started early, making our way through the neighborhoods we knew. The decorations were typical: grinning pumpkins, fake spider webs, the occasional scarecrow. It was fun, but we were looking for something more, something that would give us a real scare. We joked about hitting the older part of town, where the houses stood dark and empty, but no one took it seriously. At least, not until we reached the end of Maple Street. That's when we saw it. A house at the end of the block. It had been abandoned for years, shutters hanging loose, ivy crawling up the sides. But tonight, for the first time in ages, the porch light was on, casting an orange glow over the steps. Tom was the first to notice. "Hey, check it out," he said, pointing with his flashlight. "They're actually giving out candy this year?" "Probably just some kids messing around," Jamie replied, but his voice wavered slightly. "You know how people dare each other to stay there overnight." Sarah shivered and pulled her witch's hat down over her ears. "It's creepy, that's what it is. Come on, let's just go to the next street." But I found myself staring at the front door. It was slightly ajar, creaking open with each gust of wind. A small wooden sign was propped against the steps, painted in thick, red letters, "Trick or treat." "I think we should check it out," I said, feeling a thrill of excitement mixed with a growing sense of unease. "Come on, it'll be fun." Tom grinned, always up for a dare. "Yeah, why not? I bet it's just some lame setup for a scare." Jamie hesitated, then sighed. "Fine, but if we end up running for our lives, I'm blaming you." Sarah was the most reluctant, but eventually we convinced her, and we walked up the cracked sidewalk, our footsteps echoing in the stillness. The air grew colder as we approached the door, and the night seemed to swallow up the usual sounds of distant laughter and rustling leaves. It was as if this place existed in its own pocket of silence. Tom reached out and knocked on the doorframe, the sound echoing strangely through the empty halls inside. We waited, our breaths fogging the air. "Guess no one's home," Jamie said, but his voice was barely more than a whisper. "Maybe they left the candy inside?" I suggested, stepping forward, and then, without warning, the door swung open, creaking loudly. It revealed a hallway lined with faded wallpaper, the darkness swallowing up whatever lay beyond. The smell of damp wood and something else, something metallic, drifted out, making my stomach churn. Bad idea," Sarah muttered, but I was already stepping over the threshold. "Just a quick look," I said. "Come on, what's the worst that could happen?" Tom laughed, but it sounded nervous. Jamie and Sarah followed reluctantly, their footsteps shuffling behind us. As soon as we were all inside, the door creaked shut behind us, but it didn't quite close. It hung open just a crack, letting in a thin sliver of moonlight. "Hello?" Tom called out, his voice bouncing off the walls. "Trick or treat?" We all waited, but there was no response, only the faint groan of the house settling. The hallway led into a living room, where old furniture covered in white sheets loomed like ghosts in the darkness. A broken chandelier dangled from the ceiling, casting shadows that twisted with every breath of wind. On the dusty coffee table in the center of the room, there was a small, rusty tin with a handwritten note taped to it. "Take one." Tom snorted. "Wow, spooky. Who writes notes like that?" He flipped open the tin, revealing a few ancient-looking pieces of candy, their wrappers faded and yellowed with age. "Looks like nobody's touched these in years," Jamie said, picking one up and inspecting it under the beam of his flashlight. Sarah crossed her arms, frowning. "Can we just leave? This place gives me the creeps." I was about to agree when I noticed something strange on the note. It wasn't just the words, there was a drawing beneath them. A small, crude figure, like a stick man, standing in front of a dark doorway. "What's that supposed to be?" I asked, but the others just shrugged. We all stood there in the dim light, unsure of what to do next. And that's when we heard it, a soft, shuffling sound coming from the hallway we'd just left. "Did you hear that?" Jamie whispered, turning his flashlight toward the door. The beam trembled in his hand. "It's just the wind," Tom said, but he didn't sound sure. He took a step back, glancing at the door that still stood slightly ajar. The sliver of moonlight was gone now, replaced by a deeper darkness. The sound came again, closer this time. A slow, dragging noise like something being pulled across the floor. "Okay, that's it. I'm out," Sarah said, moving toward the door. But when she reached it, she froze. "Guys," she said, her voice barely a breath. "It's different." We crowded behind her, looking over her shoulder. The door still stood slightly open, but what lay beyond it wasn't the porch. It was a different hallway, one lined with mirrors that stretched into darkness. "I swear, that's not what it looked like before," I said, my mouth dry. Tom pushed the door open wider, revealing the mirrored corridor beyond. The air that spilled out was colder, biting through our thin costumes, and in the nearest mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement. "Did you see that?" Jamie said, pointing. "There's someone in there." We all stared into the glass, seeing our own pale, wide-eyed reflections, and something else. A figure stood further down the hallway, just out of reach of the light. It was tall and thin, its face obscured in shadow, but its eyes gleamed, a sickly yellow light that pierced through the darkness. It started to move toward us, its footsteps slow and deliberate. And then I realized, with a chill of horror, that it wasn't just walking. It was mimicking our movements, each step matching ours, but with a twisted, unnatural grace. "Shut the door," Sarah screamed, but when Tom grabbed the handle, it wouldn't budge. The figure in the mirror came closer, and as it did, its face began to twist, stretching into a grotesque grin that spread too wide, the skin around its mouth splitting like old leather. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. "What is this? What's happening?" The figure reached the edge of the mirror nearest us, and its hand, long, bony fingers tipped with sharp nails, pressed against the glass from the inside. And then, with a sound like shattering ice, the glass cracked. A thin, dark liquid seeped from the fractures, dripping onto the floor. "It's trying to get out," Jamie whispered, his voice barely audible. The mirrors along the corridor began to crack, one by one, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across their surfaces. The figure moved between them, its grin widening, the sound of its laughter mingling with the splintering glass. The air was filled with the sound of breaking glass as all the mirrors shattered at once, and the figure stepped out, towering over us, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I ran for the door, the one that led back into the living room, but when I threw it open, it led into another hallway, one just like the mirrored corridor, stretching endlessly into darkness. Sarah's scream echoed through the house, and when I turned, she was gone, her shadow swallowed by the dark. I felt a cold, bony hand clamp down on my shoulder, and I turned to see the figure, its mouth inches from my ear. It whispered something in a voice that sounded like dry leaves scraping over stone, words I couldn't understand, but that filled my mind with a terrible, creeping dread. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the front door, standing open, revealing an endless night beyond. And in the distance, I heard the laughter of children, faint and mocking, like a Halloween trick played by the shadows. When I woke up, I was lying on the porch, the dawn light breaking through the trees. The house behind me was silent, its door closed tight. My friends were nowhere to be found, and the street was empty, except for a small wooden sign propped against the steps. "Welcome back next year." The memory of the figure's grin haunted me as I stumbled away, knowing that whatever waited inside that house was waiting for me to return. Halloween night had always been my favorite time of the year. The decorations, the eerie music, the thrill of planning the perfect party, it all made me feel like a kid again. This year, I decided to host a party at my house. I'd spent weeks preparing, turning my place into a haunted house, complete with fake cobwebs, jack-o'-lanterns, and plastic skeletons. The invitations had gone out to my closest friends, promising a night of spooky fun and a costume contest. I had everything planned down to the last detail, from the fog machine to the creepy sound effects. By the time Halloween night arrived, I was nearly ready. It was only a couple of hours until guests would arrive, and all I had left to do was grab a few extra decorations from the basement, where I stored the old, creepy stuff I'd accumulated over the years. The basement of my house had always been a bit unsettling. It was cold, damp, and had that musty smell that never quite went away. But it was the perfect place to store all my Halloween gear. Old props, masks, ancient Halloween decorations that looked like they came straight out of a 1970s horror movie. The stairs creaked loudly as I descended, each step echoing in the dark. I flicked on the light, but as usual, it only lit up the space right at the bottom of the stairs, leaving the corners of the basement in shadow. I could see the outlines of old furniture covered with sheets, stacks of cardboard boxes, and the black garbage bags filled with decorations. As I made my way over to one of the bags, I heard a noise. It was faint at first, like a soft scraping, barely louder than a whisper. I paused, my hand halfway to the bag, straining to hear over the hum of the old boiler. It came again, closer this time, a dragging sound, like something being moved across the concrete floor. My skin prickled, and I forced a laugh at myself. Probably just a mouse, I muttered under my breath, trying to brush off the unease that had settled in my chest. But then the sound came again, louder, more deliberate. I froze, gripping the edge of a nearby shelf, my eyes darting to the darkened corners of the basement. The sound was coming from behind the old wooden storage cabinets that lined the far wall. My flashlight was upstairs, and the overhead light barely reached that part of the room, casting long shadows that seemed to shift with every flicker. "Hello?" I called out, feeling silly as soon as the word left my mouth. I forced a nervous laugh, but it died in my throat when something in the shadows moved, just slightly, but enough that I knew I hadn't imagined it. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. It almost looked like the edge of a black garbage bag, crumpled and shifting. I took a step closer, trying to get a better look. But then I heard a new sound, one that sent a chill through me. A whisper, soft, breathy, like it was right beside me. "Come closer." My blood turned to ice. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over an old box. My heart pounded in my chest, and I cursed myself for letting my imagination get the better of me. But there was something different about that voice. It wasn't my own mind playing tricks. It was real, and it was coming from the shadows in the corner. I turned to run back up the stairs, but then I heard it again, this time clearer, almost playful. "Don't go. Stay with us." I whipped around, my eyes darting to the dark corner where the noise had come from. The shadows seemed deeper there, darker than they should be, as if the light couldn't reach that part of the basement. My breath came in short gasps, and I backed up slowly, never taking my eyes off that corner. The shadows seemed to pulse, like something was moving just beyond my sight. I was almost at the stairs when the light above me flickered, then went out completely, plunging the basement into darkness. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, the tiny flashlight feature my only hope. My fingers shook as I turned it on, the small beam barely piercing the thick blackness. I swung the light around wildly, trying to find the stairs, when it caught on something in the corner. My breath hitched. There, just beyond the beam's reach, was a figure. Tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that stretched too long, ending in fingers that scraped against the floor. Its face was obscured in shadow, but I could see the glint of its eyes, yellow, slitted like a cat's, watching me with a twisted curiosity. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What was this thing? A prank? A trick of the light? But deep down, I knew this was no prank. The thing in the corner shifted, its body bending in ways that made my skin crawl, its head cocking to one side like it was trying to decide what to do with me. It took a step forward, its foot scraping across the concrete, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. I scrambled up the stairs, my heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out everything else. As I reached the top, I threw the basement door shut behind me and locked it, pressing my ear to the wood, listening for any sound from below. Silence. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe it was just the shadows playing tricks on me. But then something tapped on the other side of the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, each one sending a jolt of terror through me. I backed away, my hands shaking, and grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but my screen glitched, flickering with static. And then a message appeared on the screen, typed out as if by some unseen hand. "We just want to play." My hands went numb, and the phone slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor. I turned toward the front door, desperate to get out, but as I reached it, every light in the house went out, leaving me in total darkness, and then I heard it again. The voice, but now it was all around me, surrounding me, coming from every shadowed corner. "You can't leave, not yet." Something brushed against my leg, cold, wet, like the touch of a decaying hand. I yelped, kicking out, but my foot met only empty air. I stumbled through the dark, trying to find my way back to the kitchen, where I kept a flashlight in a drawer. My fingers fumbled with the drawer handle, pulling it open, but all I found inside was a single item, a small child's doll, its eyes missing, its face cracked. I gasped, dropping the doll to the floor, and it landed with a dull thud. But when it hit the ground, it began to laugh, a high-pitched, distorted giggle that echoed through the house. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to the front door, throwing it open, desperate for fresh air. But as I stepped out onto the porch, I froze. The entire yard was filled with figures, each one tall and thin, their limbs twisted and wrong, their eyes glowing that same sickly yellow. They stood perfectly still, surrounding the house, their faces turned toward me, and in the center of them stood the figure from the basement, its mouth stretched into a jagged grin that split its face in two. Behind me, I heard the basement door creak open, and that whisper filled my ears again, low and hungry. "Welcome to the party." And then, as if on cue, the figures all began to move, their twisted limbs jerking as they took slow, deliberate steps toward the house, toward me. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure from the basement, reaching out with those long, gnarled fingers, its grin widening as the darkness swallowed me whole. The next morning, the police found my front door hanging open, my house empty. My friends arrived for the party, but there was no sign of me, just the faint sound of giggling echoing up from the basement. And every year since, on Halloween night, that door creaks open again, as if waiting for someone new to join the party. It all started as a joke, a dare among friends. "Let's have the Halloween party somewhere spooky this year," Tom had said, a devilish grin on his face. He'd brought up the old, abandoned cabin in the woods. Rumor had it that the place had a history of strange disappearances and eerie sightings. Most people wouldn't even go near it, but that's exactly what made it irresistible for a bunch of high school seniors looking for a thrill. "Come on, it'll be fun," Jamie chimed in. "We'll bring decorations, music, everything. It's just for one night." Sarah and I exchanged uneasy glances, but in the end, the excitement won out over common sense. We loaded up our cars with all the essentials, drinks, snacks, costumes, and drove out to the woods just as the sun began to set on Halloween night. The cabin was about a mile off the main road, hidden deep in the forest. The dirt path that led to it was overgrown, forcing us to park our cars by the side of the road and hike the rest of the way with flashlights. By the time we reached the cabin, twilight had turned into full darkness, and the woods around us seemed to come alive with the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. The cabin loomed up before us, its wooden exterior dark and weathered by years of neglect. The roof sagged in places, and several of the windows were boarded up. But as we approached, we could see that someone had been there recently, perhaps other thrill-seekers like us. The front door was hanging ajar, creaking on its rusty hinges. "Looks like we're not the first ones with this bright idea," I muttered, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. Tom shrugged, kicking aside some fallen leaves on the front porch. "That just means it's safe, right? Come on, let's get everything set up before it gets too late." Inside, the cabin was even more unsettling. Cobwebs draped across the ceiling beams, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. The air was stale, with a faint, sweet smell that I couldn't quite place. But we did our best to ignore the creepy vibes as we set up the party. We draped fake cobwebs over the old furniture, lit up jack-o'-lanterns, and set up a portable speaker to blast some Halloween-themed music. Jamie cracked open a beer and leaned against the dusty fireplace, grinning. "See? Not so bad. Just a little old and spooky, but perfect for a Halloween party." Sarah still looked uneasy, glancing at the shadows in the corners of the cabin, but she managed to smile. Yeah, I guess. Just let's not wander off, okay? I couldn't blame her. Even with the decorations and the music, there was something about the cabin that felt wrong, like the darkness around us was heavier, denser than it should be. As the night went on, we tried to enjoy ourselves. We danced, told ghost stories, and laughed at how ridiculous we'd all looked carrying supplies through the woods. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that seemed to flicker too quickly across the room, or a shape in the window that disappeared when I turned my head. At one point, Sarah wandered into the kitchen area to grab another drink. When she didn't come back after a few minutes, I went to check on her, figuring she'd just gotten lost in the dusty clutter of the old place. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice echoing through the darkened hallway. I found her standing by the back window, staring out into the woods. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "What's wrong?" I asked, coming up beside her. She pointed out the window, and I followed her gaze. At first, I didn't see anything, just the dark line of trees, the moonlight casting long shadows over the undergrowth. But then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the tree line. It was too far away to make out any details, but something about its posture made my skin crawl. It was tall and thin, its limbs long and twisted, like they didn't quite fit together properly. "Do you think it's someone messing with us?" Sarah whispered, her breath fogging up the glass. "Maybe another group that heard about the cabin?" I tried to sound reassuring, but my voice came out shaky. "Yeah, probably. Let's get back to the others, okay?" We returned to the main room, trying to brush off the encounter. But even as we rejoined the party, I could feel the weight of that figure's gaze, like it was burning through the walls of the cabin. As the clock inched toward midnight, the atmosphere shifted. The music began to stutter, the speaker crackling with static. The candles in the jack-o'-lanterns flickered, their flames shrinking until they were barely more than embers. And the sweet smell in the air grew stronger, turning sour, like something rotting. Tom, always the jokester, was the first to notice. "Guess the cabin's finally tired of our company," he said with a laugh, but there was a nervous edge to his voice. Jamie tried to turn the music back up, but the speaker only hissed louder, emitting a low, garbled sound, like a voice speaking from underwater. He smacked it in frustration. "Damn thing's busted. We should just head out, guys." Just as he said it, we heard a noise, a low, rhythmic thumping coming from beneath us. It was deep, almost like the beat of a drum, and it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. We all froze, exchanging uneasy glances. "What the hell is that?" Sarah whispered. Tom tried to joke, but his voice cracked. "Probably just the old pipes, right? Nothing to worry about." But the thumping continued, growing louder, more insistent, like something trying to break through the floor. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, feel the sweat beating on my forehead. And then the door to the basement creaked open. None of us had even noticed there was a basement door before. It was hidden in the corner, behind a stack of old boxes. The door hung open now, revealing a set of narrow wooden stairs leading down into pitch darkness. A cold draft blew up from below, carrying that awful sweet stench. "Okay, no, we're leaving. Now," Sarah said, her voice shaking as she grabbed my arm. But Tom, stubborn as always, shook his head. "No, wait. Maybe there's something down there. Maybe it's just some animal or..." He trailed off as he stepped closer to the open door, peering down into the darkness. The shadows seemed to writhe at the edge of the flashlight beam, and the air grew colder the closer he got to the stairs. Before I could stop him, he started down the steps. The rest of us stood frozen, watching the beam of his flashlight bob up and down as he descended. The light disappeared for a moment, and then we heard him call up. "Guys, you need to see this. There's..." The sound cut off, replaced by a wet, crunching noise, followed by a strangled gurgle. "Tom!" Jamie shouted, but there was no response, only the sound of something being dragged across the basement floor. We didn't think, we ran. Sarah, Jamie, and I sprinted for the front door, yanking it open. But as we stepped outside, we skidded to a halt. The figure we'd seen earlier was there, standing right in front of the cabin. It was closer now, close enough that I could see the way its skin hung loose on its bones, like old sagging leather. Its face, if you could call it that, was a mask of stretched skin with a too-wide smile carved into it and eyes that glowed like embers. We stumbled back, slamming the door shut, but it was too late. The thumping noise returned, this time from all around us, vibrating through the walls, the floor, even the air itself. The door to the basement burst open behind us, and out of the darkness crawled something that should not have existed, a twisted shape, all bone and sinew, its limbs bent at impossible angles. Its head turned toward us with a sickening crack, and it opened its mouth, releasing that same garbled, underwater voice from the speaker. "You shouldn't have come here." We turned to run, but the cabin seemed to shift around us, the hallways stretching, twisting in on themselves like a funhouse gone wrong. The front door was gone, replaced by a wall of old, splintered wood. The windows showed only darkness beyond, the trees outside swallowed up by a thick, unnatural fog. Jamie stumbled, falling behind, and the last thing I saw was the thing from the basement reaching out for him, its fingers elongating like shadowy tendrils. Sarah and I ran deeper into the cabin, desperate to find another way out. But every room led back to the same place, the basement stairs, yawning open like the mouth of some ancient beast. The last candle went out, plunging us into complete darkness, and I felt a cold, slimy hand close around my wrist. Sarah's scream echoed through the darkness, cut short by a gurgling sound that turned my blood to ice. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, and I felt myself being pulled toward the open basement door, the whispers filling my mind with a chorus of voices, all saying the same thing. "Stay with us." I fought, but the darkness was too strong, wrapping around me like a shroud, pulling me down the stairs, deeper into the black. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was that twisted, smiling face peering down at me from the top of the stairs, its mouth stretching wider, the voice hissing through the shadows, "Welcome to the party." And then there was only darkness and the distant sound of a door creaking shut.